Every night in Australia, 46,000 children and young people are not able to sleep safely in their own beds at home, as they are at risk of being abused or neglected. Australian Childhood Foundation works to protect children and restore their childhoods through relationships that guide, support, and have the power to help children living with trauma to heal. They provide specialist therapeutic support to children to help them recover and feel safe, as well as educating and empowering communities to safeguard children from abuse. Help Australian Childhood Foundation make a difference in the lives of our community's most vulnerable children and young people. To learn more about the specialist therapeutic support they provide to help children heal, visit www.childhood.org.au.
Craig McMillan, the National Executive Manager for Partnerships at the Australian Childhood Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us on our Impact Leaders series webinar.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
No, it's really our pleasure, and it strikes me just watching that video, of course, how powerful and emotive it is when considering children. One of our other partners is Save the Children, who are, of course, working globally on large, complex issues facing children in Australia, but mostly in the developing world. And it would strike me that most people, unless they know of a child who have been impacted, may not have any idea of how prevalent this issue is in Australia. Could you perhaps, before we dive into that, perhaps just share more broadly, what does the Australian Childhood Foundation do?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. The foundation's been around for about 35 years now, and it started from a small group of very vocal advocates that wanted to stand up for children's rights and were concerned about what they were observing there was a couple of doctors involved, the Birrell brothers, and one of those founders was the chief medical officer in Victoria and was seeing extreme cases of abuse and even fatalities with small children, and there was no conversation around what was happening. And that's not a long time ago for that to be the case. I remember Robert Birrell telling me of a story where the discussion was had in the closet in the hospital because it was not policy to discuss some of the outcomes that were facing children. So they got very active and vocal, formed Australians Against Child Abuse with a group of social workers, some lawyers and police. And that was the seed sort of, and the foundation's founding kind of origin. And from there, it's grown to an organisation that now works in therapeutic care across the country with centres nationally now that work directly with children and families and the circles of care around kids, so that they're made safer, but they're also helped to heal from the trauma that they experience. And trauma has lasting effects on children's lives, as we know. You know, the Royal Commission's a perfect example of the impact of long-standing trauma and what it does to young people and to a lifetime. And so the foundation recognised that there, to take a holistic approach to helping children heal and to keeping them safe. It meant that we had to develop a number of services. One is therapeutic care. We work in residential care and out-of-home care. And if I was to tell you kind of what the foundation's specialty is, it's probably making sure that the professionals in those environments actually understand those children, that they understand what's required to make relationships powerful, loving and healing for children. And to do that, you need to understand what trauma does to a child. So that's kind of the focus of our work.
And of course, we have a much greater understanding of intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
And like you started to touch on the extent to which this lives in the body, lives in the family, often gets perpetrated, as these children become adults, there is that tendency. Can we touch on your background a little further? What have you always worked in this sector, or what inspired you to perhaps move to the Australian Childhood Foundation specifically?
Yeah, I actually haven't, Jeremy. I mean, now it's been a long time. I've been at the foundation for nearly 16, 17 years, I think it is now. So it's a long time. And it's always felt like more of a mission than a job or a role. And that's, in that sense, it's the nature, I think, of advocacy and not-for-profit work, is that there's a direct link from the work that you're doing to, for me as a father. I started this when I became a father, really. So that was one of my motivations, to recognize the vulnerability of children and to be concerned about that at a personal level. And I was fortunate enough and I came from a marketing and communications background and media. I used to work for Fairfax and in a kind of different environment. So I wanted to use some of those skills and add value to the NFP that I started with. But I've stayed, I think, because it was really important for me to continue in this space, because the more exposed I've become to the level of trauma within the Australian community, the more motivated I am, and I know my colleagues are, to make a real difference. And that can be frustrating, and that can be disappointing, and in moments it can be inspiring, but it's a mixed bag for sure.
Yeah, it's sadly you'll never be out of a job, will you?
No.
Given I mean, we'd like to all not need to work in this sector. Ideally, these issues didn't exist, but sadly, that's not the case. And I thank you for sharing that. It strikes me as we've done a number of these interviews now, and just how passionate people are about the work and about their commitment. And it's ongoing, it's unyielding, it's profound. And yet at the same time, while it could be heartbreaking, it often seems to light people up, because you know every day that you're making an impact. What, in respect to the work of the foundation specifically, how would you say it is unique in terms of its focus, its methodology, and impact? I mean, there's a number of NGOs and small organisations working with children directly. This is now quite a large and established organisation in Australia. What would you say makes it stand out and be unique in its impact and methodology?
We've grown from, just to talk to that, we've grown from when I started, we had 30 people. We're now a couple of hundred people, of which 90% of those are specialists working in the field, in either therapeutic care or in some way educating other professionals. We've got 32 partnerships across the country. I think that's really important. I think partnerships are a significant kind of part of what we do. There are, as you said, Jeremy, there are other NGOs working in the same space, doing similar things in some cases. This sector is, I went to a meeting the other day with my colleagues from a number of other not-for-profits, and quite often you're even seeing duplication, which I know is frustrating for us all, because we're sometimes competing for the same funding, we're competing for the same opportunities to drive this change. But I think the thing that we've done that's had a significant impact on the work that we've done is our work with children has, over this period of time, has informed the neuroscience, and we've done a lot of research, and it supports the kind of models that we implement across the country. So we've had a big impact in things like out-of-home care and residential care and foster care. And if I talked about, I'll give you one example, Jeremy. One is, one that really sort of lights me up is when children come into either a foster care or residential care unit let's use foster care. Quite often, because of their behaviour, because of the trauma they've experienced, the placements are unstable. There are stories where kids come in with a plastic bag, put it on the bed, and don't unpack anything because they're pretty clear in their own mind. Within a day, within hours, they will be out of there, and they'll be going to the next place. And that disturbance after experiencing severe trauma is re-traumatizing. So to see through our work placements where a child could be in 20 to 30, even more, there are cases of a lot more, this situation of being in a rotating environment, no sense of home, no sense of family or belonging, and to see that change to a single placement that lasts for years, and for a child to find stability and some adults in their life that they can actually begin to trust, where they can build a sense of relationship, where they can go back to school, where they can re-engage friends, where they can start to actually have a childhood. To see that shift in a child is incredible. I mean, that's, and our statistics for that change are really high particularly in things like out-of-home care, in foster care, where we're having real breakthroughs because the programs help the foster carer or the residential care carer to understand that child's behaviour. So when they react or respond to something, we might, saying to a kid like, Johnny, don't do that, and then that child going off and breaking the windows in the house because they're responding. So helping the foster carer to have different ways of communicating and understanding how that trauma's impacted the child makes a massive difference. And I think that's one of the key and subtle and small things in some ways that does change the outcomes for children.
Could you touch further on the neurological impacts of trauma? From my understanding, and this is from the work of a leader who went into a prison in Delhi to meet the man who'd raped, and ultimately that woman had died from her injuries, and was just astounded at sort of the banality of evil, to quote a well-known phrase, and wanted to understand, what happens in the minds of, in this case, it was young men, to believe that this behaviour was somehow or in any way acceptable, and started to realise the extent to which they had been traumatised as young boys. And her research showed that actually the brain is far more neuroplastic at a younger age than we expected, even at kindergarten age. And it's so critical that young boys and girls are given examples of healthy relationships, and because it's such a powerful time in the formation of a young person's mind. Can you, it's such a fascinating field, this, and of course sets the foundation for understanding, what can be a lifetime of behaviours as a result. Could you perhaps share some of the findings? I think it would be really interesting to hear it firsthand, what you're seeing in this field, and perhaps even how it's changed from our understanding several years ago.
I think the idea that certainly the idea of early intervention, Jeremy, is critical. The longer and the more sustained exposure to trauma, of course, the impact of that on the neurobiology of a child is dramatic, and it affects the capacity to learn. It affects their capacity to think, hold relationships. If you see a child who's suffered deep trauma, their capacity to even look at you in the eyes, to even make eye contact, is null and void, because everything, when they make eye contact, there is threat. So the brain's hardwired to go to fight, flight, to respond to the world as threat. And so that child's behavior is an adaptation from their experience. They're trying to respond to a world that's been threatening and violent and difficult, and where nothing's safe. And I've heard it defined as the example of a kind of computer having a system meltdown, an overload, because the very people that was meant to kind of love and support that child are the ones very often violating them. So the brain doesn't know how to process that. The brain doesn't know what to do with that. And so it sets itself up to respond to a world of threat. So I think the opportunity when you try and support a child to, lack of a better term, rewire that kind of sense of threat, to be able to feel safe, to have a relationship that's supportive. It does take time, because we're talking about many of the children in our services have had 1, 2, and 3 different types of abuse, and it's quite severe. So it can take time, but once a child's removed from the threat and in a relationship that's supportive and encourages play and the very natural parts of a child to explore and enjoy relationship, change happens. And we see that change happen in some cases quickly, in some cases over time. 12, 18 months of therapy in our services is common. It's never enough, is the reality. And our services, for example, have waiting lists and long waiting lists in some cases. So there are children out there that are not getting exposure to positive relationships and not getting supported, who are sitting in isolation with that sense of threat. So the implications on the brain are dramatic, Jeremy. It affects learning. It means that the capacity to learn, to make friends, to keep friends, to have relationships is all dramatically impacted. They struggle to keep friends and to have what we would consider normal relationships. So that, as you know, that can have a lifetime of impact.
Yeah.
Capacity to hold down jobs, the turning to drugs, alcohol, they're symptoms of those deeper problems.
And for context, what kind of figures are you seeing in terms of percentage of within Australian families serious abuse is occurring?
Well, I think that the biggest kind of piece of research that is interesting for people to look at is the recent one that's come out from the maltreatment study, which would indicate that more broadly, there's something like 62% of the population, the Australian population, has had one form of abuse in their childhood. I mean, that's staggering when you think about that percentage of the Australian population.
And just for clarification, we're not talking about a parent shouting at the child. This is physical or sexual abuse. Is that
this is some form. Well, it's across a number, but the definition would define that it was some form of serious violence, or it could be family violence, or some form of abuse that could be sexual or other. And I think Steph has just put up the link to that research. So, but those staggering figures, and there have been no really good national consensus on the types of figures or the scope of the problem till now, which in itself is amazing. But that study is an inroad into understanding the gravity of the problem. And then if you want to add to that, Jeremy, in a relatively, it's not new, but certainly the impact of online exploitation abuse now is exploding. The kind of access to children and the opportunity for children and perpetrators to be closer, quicker to children than they have ever been by entering into the mobile devices in their bedroom or on their computer when they're playing games. So, we expect to see, because of that, statistics on the increase in terms of exposure to risks.
the perpetrators at home, would it be fair to say that they're mostly the male of the household?
Yes.
Do you have figures on the percentage approximately?
Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure of the statistics, but the representation of male perpetrators is a lot higher. Online, interestingly though, the victims are quite often young boys. I was at a recent meeting at the ACCE where they talked about who are the people that are doing the online the scouting and looking for the perpetrators online, which is quite a confronting role that they play. But their research shows that, in fact, some of in the online environment, that the victims are quite often young boys. So it's but certainly young girls and children, the gender imbalance for females is a lot higher. I think it's 2.4 times female to male for sexual abuse. So the perpetrators are mostly males.
Yeah, which maps to the stats around family violence in general. Where the perpetrators are men against women and children.
Absolutely.
It sounds like
power imbalance.
A profound, such a devastating and complex issue. Can you talk to us about some of the programs being run by the ACF? I mean, how do you not only combat this issue, but once you have a child in your care, you've touched on it briefly. It'd be interesting to see, perhaps, understand the evolution of the programs, and also what do you see as some of those key challenges and opportunities moving forward as an organisation to address this complex issue?
I think so. The therapeutic work that I mentioned that we're doing nationally is dealing with and tries to deal with some of the most extreme cases where children have been removed from their families. Quite often, they're either in residential care or they're in a foster family or out of home care. And so our work there is to work directly with a child, but also the circles of care that exist around that child, because to make, for example, those placement figures that I mentioned, to make those work, you've really got to work with the people, the teachers, the carers that are going to be responsible for those children. You really have to work with all of those parties around the child to ensure that they understand, because you're quite often dealing with extreme behaviours and problem behaviours. So those there's a need to create safety in the people around those children, but also a sense of awareness and knowledge so that they understand that behaviour and what trauma, the impact of trauma. And so there's that therapeutic work that's happening, and that's happening through a number of different programs in different states. We work in Indigenous and remote communities. We work and those are different adaptations and partnerships with Indigenous community, and our Indigenous team lead those in a positive and sort of proactive way with Indigenous leaders. And the other work that we do is also we run trauma conference twice every 2 years, and that conference is once again about informing the sector on the latest in neurobiology and science and treatments and models and the approaches to dealing with trauma. And we run preventative programs like Bringing Up Great Kids, which is a kind of positive parenting program that's aimed at sort of giving skills to vulnerable parents. So there's a number of approaches, Jeremy, and quite often, with 200 people across the country is stretched, and in no means can we do it alone. As I said, we have 32 partners across the country. We're also one of the sort of founding partners of the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, which was an initiative off the back of the Royal Commission and the inquiries. We're heading up an online exploitation project called It's Never Too Late, We have initiatives like Emma's Project, which is a group of it's a survivor-led project that's giving voice to the victims of child sexual abuse, and it's predominantly, probably 85 to 90% run by young girls and young women, and we're guiding that project. So that's coming out. That's already out, and there's a piece of research out that's been done by that survivor-led group. And we're also now, for the first time, we got some seed funding from Westpac about a year ago, and we've started a business coalition for the safety of children. And that project launches in November on the 22nd in Sydney. And that's all about making businesses safe for children. So businesses that have contact points, supply chains, anything that involves young people and children. How do those businesses consider the role that they need to play in making sure that the children, either in their care or if they have in contact or in their employee, how do they take a role in making it a safer place? How do they make work environments safer? And how do they make business overall safer for children? So that's a really interesting initiative. It has Westpac, it's got IHG Hotels, Microsoft have signed on. We've got some very big companies that are sort of coming to the forefront as the founding membership. So I think for business, that's a really, it's the first sort of cross-sector initiative of its type. So you can see in that, Jeremy, there's a kind of a lot of tentacles trying to do things across a lot of spaces to make sure that, because this is a broad sweeping issue that requires the whole community to think about it.
The whole community response. Do you work directly with perpetrators?
There are some of our projects through the Bringing Up Great Kids that have worked with, when I say perpetrators, I'm talking mostly about probably family violence. So we have had projects working with fathers that have had issues around and experiences themselves of family violence, and then becoming perpetrators of that same family violence with their own families. And we've had a couple of projects working with some fathers and men around their behaviour and thinking about the role that their behaviour plays in damaging their families. And so that's kind of a proactive prevention program that we've operated. But most of our work tends to be with the victims and family, and quite often in those cases, women and young children. That's probably the largest focus of our work.
Craig, you've obviously been not only working in this sector for many years, but passionate about it. Can I ask, where did that passion and commitment come from personally? What was it a moment for you, or a series of moments?
I think, look, to be perfectly frank, I think this is often an issue we think is somewhere off, far away from us. The reality of this is an issue that's very often very close to us. And in my scenario, growing up as a young person, I have had experience with aspects of these issues. So it has a personal resonance for me. And I've had friends and people that I know who have experienced, and it's no surprise then when you see the maltreatment studies research and see the indicators of how broad sweeping these issues are. But for me personally, I have seen the impact of trauma all around me, and I think having a personal touch point for that trauma and those experiences motivates you, one, to understand it better, but also to want to make a change in, to focus your energy and to focus your, sometimes your frustration at I think, Jeremy, at how violent sometimes and how damaging we can be to each other and within society. So for me, the drive is to want to see a change in that. And when you think about the idea of children and young people being hurt by adults and by the people that are meant to love and care for them. I mean, that's overwhelming. And I think the timing for me around becoming a young, becoming a dad and having a young boy around me and thinking, how could anyone do that, and why would they, led to me wanting to understand the why and to wanting to make a difference in the why. So that's kind of the personal motivator for me.
Thank you for sharing that. It raises also such a profound and important point, which I remember when initially I started talking to NGOs in Australia to learn about how prevalent violence against women was. And I remember a senior police constable saying to me, this issue can only exist in the shadows, which literally means behind people's closed doors. And it could be happening as close as next door. And we won't know about it because we don't live in communities like we used to. And there isn't that accountability amongst elders. And so this can be going on literally next door, down the street, amongst co-workers. And sadly, often we don't know until it can be too late. So really extraordinary work, and devastating to again be reminded of how prevalent this is in the community, much more than any of us would expect. And of course, running such an extraordinary organization takes money, money to keep the lights on and help move, engaging incredible people and run programs that can be reported on and innovated over time. I'm really proud that we've been able to raise already over $230,000 and counting from I Equal Change for the Australian Childhood Foundation. Can you give our listeners a sense of what impact does funding like that create for the foundation and the people you serve?
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, and I want to thank you personally for that contribution. I mean, one of the beautiful things about not only the financial impact, which I'll talk to, but the quite often in the not-for-profit world, there's a lot of time and energy and effort spent trying to create pathways for funding, and to have a pathway that works so simply, so elegantly, in a sense, where we don't really have to think about the effort or putting in teams or employing lots of people to drive that funding. It just comes to us from you, and it comes from the motivation of companies and through the vehicle of product and their own product sales. It's a uniquely simple and efficient way of delivering support to worthwhile causes. So from my perspective, it's efficient and cost saving. So thank you for that, because it's really often a lot of work for us to raise money. It can cost a lot of money to bring money through the door to drive programs. So we use the funding that comes from I Equals Change directly to boost some of our therapeutic care work. I mentioned to you when we were off screen that we have some waiting lists. I was horrified to find out that the other day that one of our waiting lists is as long as 4 years. I mean, for a child to come into a service, that means if a 14-year-old has suffered some form of trauma and abuse, and they're trying to get into a service, they are able to get into that service, and then they're not even eligible because most of our services stop at that point. So we try to take kids off those waiting lists. So that 230,000 allows us, outside of some of the government funding that we get at a state level to drive therapeutic services, allows us to pull kids off waiting lists. It allows us to add additional resources to that therapeutic care and that work. So it's potent. I said to you, I get frustrated sometimes at the sorts of numbers we're talking about, the sorts of gaps that we're talking about in the care around children. But the positive part is to see one child, one at a time, one family shift at a time, to see one community impacted through this sort of additional funding is why I keep pushing the work that I do to drive funding. So it's very, it has a significant on the ground impact, and it means sessions. It literally means relationships that those children I mentioned before, those really important positive relationships that those children need, open up for them.
Thanks for saying that, and it's true that in the early days we started thinking, well, how do we remove that barrier so that great organisations can just get on and do their work? So it's really wonderful to hear that we're providing a small pathway to enable that to happen. How can I Could Change businesses continue to help?
I think I mentioned the coalition project. So if any of your businesses are interested in understanding, what are the things that we're maybe not thinking about in our supply chains? What does safeguarding children look like for a business that might even assume that we don't even have touch points with children? I think that's a really interesting and powerful new proposition for cross-sector engagement at a business level. As I said, it's the kind of first of its type. It's got some big businesses coming to it, Westpac and others that are trying to drive this initiative. I would love to see more businesses raising their hands to say, hey, we would like to find out more about that. I think that's one thing. Another thing about this issue is that it's quite often, as you said, Jeremy, it's invisible. And the longer this issue stays in the dark, the more prevalence there will be of the sorts of statistics that we talk about. So sometimes awareness and helping us build awareness is something that we look for in our corporate partners, is that brands that want to get on and kind of tell the story alongside us, work on campaigns with us, think about some of the things that we're doing in I mentioned the online exploitation campaign that we have coming up. It's Never Too Late. The Emma's project with the survivors of child sexual abuse. Some of those projects can really be supported by good partnership leverage. And I think, that's probably the main things that would be really beneficial to us as an NFP.
So it's interesting how that space sounds like it maps quite closely to the ESG initiatives that a number of businesses are looking to address. And I think that's not only important, but fantastic work, because it kind of looks at, okay, what are businesses' ultimate responsibilities to their broader community? Typically, a business would have said, oh, well, we're not selling directly to children, or we have children working for us, therefore that's where our responsibility stops. And that's largely not considered accurate anymore. And so fantastic to hear. So for any I Could Change businesses that are listening, many of them are, reach out and we can put you in touch with Craig. I do note that we're moving, time seems to speed up this time of the year, leading into Christmas. And for many NGOs, this is actually a time of great need, where families are stressed, people are under pressure financially, and this, of course, is never an excuse, but these kinds of conditions can often exacerbate family violence. And so a really fantastic and important time to come on board and begin giving back to organisations like the Australian Childhood Foundation to help families at a time when, especially this year, given what's happened economically, there's a number, and much more than anyone would guess. I mean, we know from a food security perspective, up to 18% of families are unsure about paying for the next week's grocery bills. Now, this is extraordinary in a country as rich as Australia. And of course, these issues are intertwined, interconnected, and often they do predicate and lead to different forms of abuse on the most vulnerable, which is children. Craig, what keeps you going each day? What do you most look forward to?
Great question. I think interestingly, the older I get, it changes, but it's fundamentally the relationships in our life, and so that circles back to what we're talking about, Jeremy. I mean, relationships are fundamental, aren't they, to human existence and to who we are, and our happiness and our well-being is all predicated on good relationships. That is the nature of being human. So, well, it's certainly a big part of it. So I think the good relationships and feeling as though you are supported and loved and that you're able to love others is critical to feeling good. And so I think, again, that comes back to why this work becomes so important. To see that broken in a child's life, to see a child that can't have that or is suffering because they're unable to experience love, to experience that feeling that we all long for, is, and I don't want to move back to doom and gloom, but I think that drives me as a person to have, on a daily level, to have good relationships. And so, and I hope that we create that for others and for young people.
And many years from now, when you look back on your professional life, what do you believe you will be most proud of?
I think it's, I'd love our legacy to be, I'd love to sign off on this work at some point. I know it's probably unrealistic when I look at the history of the issue in this country. We ran some research recently that is community attitudes towards this issue, and it hasn't changed a lot. It sits somewhere under roads and footpaths when unprompted. When you prompt someone about the issue of child abuse, it goes to number one, but it's sitting pretty low in a series of community priorities, really. I would love to think that by the time I leave this organisation and this issue in this way, that as a community we better understand the impact of trauma, that we better understand the issue and what it does to our community. To see those, the reality is we're all living with this. It's having an impact, and it's massive. It's having a massive social impact. It's having an impact on the way we work, the way we live. And so I would love to see greater awareness around what's causing trauma in families. How do we better prioritize it? How do we do more to care around not just our own children and families, but other kids and others' families? And how do we become a more cohesive community?
More cohesive and more compassionate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if you could look back and know you moved the dial in a meaningful way, I dare say that would be something
that
would could rest well with. Yeah. Craig McMillan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been such a privilege to hear this directly from you and to give our listeners an understanding of the nature of the work, the complexity of the work, sadly the prevalence of the work, and the window into who you are and why you're so deeply committed. You and your, I'm sure, a remarkable team working alongside you, who are looking to address this and is addressing this issue nationally. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Pleasure, and thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it.